10, 9, ignition sequence start. All engines are running.
Liftoff, and the clock is liftoff.
Roger, the clock is operating. We're underway.
It's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
And it's a big old giant leap for us, too, right into the second episode of Kerbalcast. It is the podcast that is devoted exclusively to Kerbal Space Program. And I am your LMP, that's Lunar Module Pilot, Biff Aldrin. With me, as always, is my Command Module Pilot, my CMP,
Nostromo,
the man who completes me.
Well,
that's my Jerry Maguire reference.
I would say
you just don't know what to say to that, do you?
Yeah, I was stunned.
You were stunned? You were stunned. You're my Renee Zellweger.
Anyway, back to the podcast.
We have a full program for you today. We are bursting at the seams, and Nostromo is going to tell us what's coming up.
Today's mission plan includes an interview with Dr. Wallace Fowler, Professor of Aerospace Engineering, news, the crew report, debut our very own soap opera, As the Curtain Turns, and the But I Digress segment, where we interject a little something besides Kerbal, and we talk about our favorite space movies.
And also, before we go any further, I do want to say a big thank you to everybody who took the time to download the podcast, to listen to the podcast. A lot of folks wrote in. We got lots of positive comments. We really, really appreciate it. We're now available on iTunes. You can even search for us. If you start typing in Kerbal in the search window, it will autocomplete Kerbal Podcast. So, you know, we've got that going for us, don't we?
Yeah.
That's a big deal.
We're on the grid.
But if you would like to join in the conversation, if you have questions, if you have comments, suggestions, you can always email us.
Kerbalpodcast@gmail.com.
And also, if you want, you can, let your fingers do the walking and you can type us an email. Or if you would like to record yourself and send us the audio as an MP3, we would certainly be glad to use it on the program as well. Now, at this point, I want to go ahead and get a progress report, because as I talked about before, I've been playing the game for about a year. And by the way, I checked on Steam. I purchased the game in July of 2013, so a little less than a year that I've been playing. You've been playing for, what, about 2 weeks now?
Yeah, 2 weeks. Steam-wise, I've acquired probably around 9 hours.
Okay. What's your progress been? What have you done so far?
Well, the first week I was just playing the sandbox mode because that's how everyone I know had started. I hadn't really heard about the career mode, and I heard that it was still being worked on. So I was just going to try the sandbox and see what I could do. And got a little bit analysis paralysis. There were so many things to work on that I just didn't know where to go. So
I never heard that expression. That's good.
I stopped and I was like, I just wasn't sure, and I built a few things. I made it into the upper atmosphere. I had a lot of crash and burns, and it was fun, but I just wasn't sure what I was supposed to be doing. Mm-hmm. So this week I tried the career mode, and it was massive progress. I did 1 hour less than last week, but I've gotten a lot farther in the game because I was able to bypass a lot of trying to figure out what everything was, because I started off with way fewer options.
Right.
I only had a couple fuel cells and thrusters and things to work with. And from that, I was able to make small goals because I needed science in order to get more parts.
Yeah, career really focuses you.
Yeah, I needed fins. Okay, well, I need to get enough science to get fins. How do I get science? Oh, I need to go this high and transmit back. So it really motivated me a lot to get those new things. Mm-hmm. And I kind of noticed that with a lot of games that I play, like Minecraft, for instance. Whenever I start off, my favorite part's the first couple of days when you're trying to survive.
Right.
Once it becomes just playing Legos and like, oh, I just want to build something for the set, just for fun.
Yeah.
I lose a lot of interest because there's no longer that, short-term goal motivation.
Well, it's what it is it's almost like, you pardon the analogy, but you've planted the garden, now you're tending it. Whereas, it's more fun to plant it than to, because once you've built the house, then it's, okay, now what?
Yeah, and the way I see it is if I do enough of these small things, I'm going to learn each individual part and how it all works together. So whenever I start doing getting things into orbit, going to other planets, going to the moon, I'm going to have a lot of those intricate parts, fundamentals down.
So you've made it into orbit. You have deorbited and landed. You've done all that. You have you tried for the Mun yet, or the moon? Moon.
I haven't made a full orbit around Kerbin yet.
Okay.
So I'm currently working on that, finding out how to get something that's not too heavy and get the most bang for my buck as far as thrust goes.
Mm-hmm.
And with working on these little goals and getting science, I noticed some parts that I was having trouble with. If you study something once, you can't really study it a second time.
Diminishing
So
returns.
I almost want to try again and just try to get as many mystery goo pods as I can in the upper atmosphere so I can really bank on some science.
Well, I don't know if this is typical, but I mean, your progress is pretty close to mine, because when I started the game, those suborbital hops, I was real good at those. Now the full orbit, not so good.
Yeah, well, the career mode is something you didn't have when you first started.
Right.
So it posed a question to me: what goals do you set? Do you currently have set, and what are you doing to work toward those goals? And without a career mode, how do you decide what you want to do?
You know how you made the comment about with Minecraft? Once you've built everything.
Yeah, once you're surviving.
Yeah, once you're down to just maintaining. Same thing with career mode. Once I've exhausted all of my science options, then it's almost maintaining. I've actually gone back and restarted career mode several times. Right now, where I'm at with my, can't remember how many run-throughs this is on career, but what I'm trying to get right now is I'm trying to get docking hatches, because finding that right balance between fuel and mass, it takes a certain amount of fuel to get you into orbit. It takes a certain amount of fuel to give you escape velocity, where you can leave Kerbin and make it to the mine. And then, of course, obviously, you need even more escape velocity if you're going to try and leave the Kerbin system and try and go to Duna or some of the other planets. Well, the only way I've been able to accomplish this, and if somebody else has a suggestion, we'd sure love to hear it. The only way I've been able to accomplish this is I will put refueling stations in orbit.
That makes sense.
Yeah, I'll put one around the mine, or I'll put one around Kerbin. And what I'll do is I'll burn a lot of fuel getting up into orbit. I'll dock, refill my, that was a tongue twister. I did it again. Refill my fuel tanks, and then I can go on and do other things. And I've actually gotten to where I'll send, refueling ships ahead of me. Like if I want to go to Duna, I'll send one there. But so far that's been the way that I've been able to actually leave various parts of the system and go to other parts. So that's my current goal right now is I'm still trying to find that fuel mass ratio.
Yeah, that's I don't have to worry about those big problems yet. I just have to worry about, the kind of important foundation issues as in leaving the planet.
Yeah. Well, like I said, I was real good on the suborbitals. Well, listen, let's go ahead and get to crew report. In our very first podcast, I had posted a series of questions on Reddit, and some folks had answered the questions. And we have a couple of more responses. I'll let you go ahead and take the first one.
Okay, this one comes from Smokey Freeman. The first question was, is your name related to anything space-oriented? And he said it's not directly linked to space, but he says whenever his latest craft explodes, he does feel like a Smokey Freeman. We also asked what was one of your worst mistakes or your greatest achievements, and he said, my worst mistake is when I took a small ion aircraft to Lathe. I built it in the
spaceplane hangar.
Spaceplane
hangar. I
hangar.
think that's what
wow,
we think.
I am that new. Just so you guys know, if there was any question before, I
You're
am very
a
new.
noob.
But I wanted to launch vertically. When I added the decoupler between the plane and the transfer stage, it was upside down. When I got to Lathe and decoupled, the decoupler stayed on the back of the engine, preventing it from producing thrust. I glided for as long as possible over ocean until sighting land. I managed to land all right, but the decoupler malplacement slightly hindered me.
I sympathize. I've had the exact same problem. Sometimes what I'll do is I'll put a craft above my docking port so that when I do decouple, the craft itself can move forward and then turn around and come back and redock. And I had that exact same problem where I would decouple.
Yeah.
And the decoupler would still be sitting on top of the docking port, And I couldn't dock. And it'd be like, okay, revert back to launch or revert back to vehicle assembly. All right, next thing that we got. This was an email, and we got it from Scott in California. Quote, I totally agree with what was said in the first episode that Kerbal Space Program has really reinvigorated my interest in space travel and exploration. I've always had a love of anything aerospace related. I grew up literally right next to Edwards Air Force Base, home of Chuck Yeager. I was always into the flight sim programs, but was always looking for a space sim program that could hold my interest. Kerbal Space Program has hit it out of the park for me. I have been playing for about a year and have thoroughly enjoyed it, and I'm looking forward to the future releases. It has the perfect mix of game and simulation for me. In what other game can you actually enjoy learning concepts of orbital mechanics, delta V, physics, gravity, etc., etc.? Even my 2 young sons enjoy it, and they both now are interested in learning about the solar system. They are so interested now that both of their teachers have commented to me that my sons have taught them a few things about space. That is cool. Thank you, Scott from California.
I think the fun part that kind of draws kids in is at first you're watching little tiny guys explode, and I mean they're gonna find that funny. You have a lot of stories.
Who doesn't?
A lot of stories of kids that they keep jumping their guy off the edge in that old platforming game because they like the noise he makes when he dies, and this is exactly that. Like so, you watch those little guys explode, and eventually you might want 1 or 2 to live.
Well, now we get to the big one. Dun dun dun. We as I said, we put out a questionnaire. Well, we got a response from somebody from Squad. Anthony Gazzardo responded. And I'm going to read a couple of these, and I want you to read a couple, okay? All right. One of the questions was, how has the game changed your perception of space? And he said, it hasn't changed my perception, but it has taught me more detailed info than I'd ever learned in my school days, which goes back to Scott from California. What's your learning curve been like? How long did it take you to get off the ground, into orbit, to the Mun, first landing, first docking, first complete mission? This is his response. In total honesty, I don't remember. My experience with and surrounding the game has been a blur of epic proportions.
Next, we asked him to tell a story of his best or worst experience in the game. Best mission, worst crash, or dumbest mistake. He said, this is neither my best nor my worst, more like most memorable. I'm a bit of the self-deprecating type, so I keep this story in my back pocket to keep me humble. It was my first time playing the game, and I decided to go in blind. Let's just say I didn't fully figure out staging at first, and many Kerbals died due to unfortunate parachute accidents.
I like that.
The next question is, what features would you like to see in the game? And he says, contracts and budgeting and multiplayer. Wait, were you expecting something else?
I love that.
Yeah.
What? Were you expecting something? What do you expect?
It's where he works.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I mean, it would be like, if we'd asked, like, what's your favorite game? He'd be like, let me think about that one for a minute. Well, now we have talked about how much this game teaches you. One of the things that it teaches you is orbital mechanics. And I thought that it would be kind of neat to actually learn a little bit more from an expert. So I did a Google search for professor of orbital mechanics. And the first response came up was University of Texas. And so I called, and the individual that answered the phone was Dr. Wallace Fowler. And he is a professor of aerospace engineering and engineering mechanics. And by the way, when I told him, I said, get ready, you're going to hear some really stupid questions. He said to me, there is no such thing. And I thought to myself, ooh, I'm going to put that to the test.
Yeah, there's no stupid questions, only stupid people.
Yeah, and
the questions that they ask.
I'm both. But anyway, my first question was this. Very simply, I asked him, why do objects orbit in space?
You're up there, and number one, you don't have any air. So there's no drag, no air resistance. Okay, you're up high enough so there's no air resistance. And if you throw something, it curves. Okay, you throw a ball up and it curves. Now let's get on a real tall tower and let's throw something and it curves and it falls to earth. And then you throw it a little faster and it curves and falls to earth. If you throw it fast enough, it curves and the earth curves underneath it at the same rate. So basically, its altitude doesn't change as it goes around because it's strung fast enough. If you throw it even faster, it goes higher above the Earth, and it comes around, and it comes back around. But basically, it's falling around the Earth, but it's moving fast enough that it just keeps falling around and around and around.
And that is the relationship between speed and altitude.
Oh, yeah, sure. Sure, and the further, higher you are in an orbit, because gravity varies with distance, it goes less. It's an inverse square law, but it gets less as you go further out. The things actually move slower in orbit at high altitudes than they do at low altitudes. You can see a satellite go over. Have you ever looked up and seen space station go over? You know, it goes across the sky pretty quick. Think about the moon. The moon doesn't go across the sky very quick at all. In fact, it just kind of hangs up there, and the Earth turns underneath it. It's way, way high. So the moon goes around us every 28 days, and it's 60 Earth radii out there, and space station goes around about every 90 minutes because it's real close in. Gravity's a lot stronger close in.
Let's talk about gravity. I have always thought of gravity in terms of if you took a bowling ball and set it in the middle of a trampoline, the warping effect of the fabric is a good way to think of gravity.
Sure. Okay. That's a good way to think of it. Now, if you think about that in gravity and you think about that warping effect of that fabric, if the fabric was real smooth and there wasn't any weaving or anything in it, and you think about, let's think about that being the Earth and the gravity's down there. If you could roll a ball or a marble sideways, perpendicular to the radius out from the center of the bowling ball, and you roll it around and you roll it around at just the right speed, it would go around and around and around that thing in a circle in that warped hole. Because you've seen these coins go down in these machines where you drop a coin and it rolls round and round and round and round and goes faster and faster and finally drops out the middle. Okay, that's the same thing. That you can think about that as being that's what an orbit is. Orbit's just going around and around, and there's not any friction when that coin rolls around. There's friction, so it goes down and further down, and finally it falls in the hole. But in orbit, there's very, very, very little if any friction. Now there's a little bit, but it's it'll come down in the order of something at 500 kilometers. It'll take it 10, 12 years to come down.
I always think in terms of a roulette wheel as well. The little marble going around, the slower it goes, it drops. Yeah, it drops, It goes around. Same thing. Explain to me why any orbit has an apoapsis and a periapsis. Okay. An apoapsis, the orbits, if you look at the laws of motion, an orbit, at least a closed orbit, now you can have things that go away forever, but any closed orbit will either be a circle or a straight line that just falls straight in, which is not of any interest, or it will be an ellipse. And what you're doing when it goes higher and goes higher and higher and higher. If it's going too fast at the low point, it'll go higher and higher and higher, and finally it's like going up a hill and you run out of energy. You fall down the hill and you speed up again, and so you're trading height for speed. As you go up, you go slow down. As you come back down, and the apoapsis is for Earth is called the apogee, and the perigee, G standing for Earth. But basically, what you're doing at the low point, you're high speed and low altitude. At the high point, you're high altitude and low speed. So you're trading energy. You're trading the energy of height for the energy of it's called kinetic and potential energy. Potential energy when you're real high, kinetic energy or energy of speed when you're real low. Even if you're tracing a circle around the equator of the Earth, you are still rising at one point and falling at the other. Maybe, maybe not. If you're in a circular orbit, you're not. You're not? No, in a circular orbit, you're at the same distance. If the Earth, consider the Earth to be a perfect sphere. If it's not a perfect sphere, you've got a little bit of weird things going on. But you can go in effectively in an almost circular orbit. You can get the orbits. You can put yourself into an orbit that's pretty darn close to circular. Or you can put yourself in an orbit that's very, very, very elliptic if you want. The orbit that goes from low Earth orbit up to geosynchronous orbit and comes back down, that thing is on one end it's at about
it's probably, it's one end of it is probably 6 times further away from the center of the Earth than the other.
I may be misunderstanding my terms here. Please correct me if I'm wrong. My understanding is when you go from apogee to perigee, you're falling, and
Yes.
when you go from perigee to apogee, you're rising.
Yes, that's true.
And isn't that also if you are at, for example, a 90-degree angle, you're tracing the equator?
I'm not sure what you mean by tracing the equator.
What I'm saying is if you were looking directly at the Earth
Okay.
on its north-south axis,
Yeah.
and you were tracing a 90-degree circle around the equator, you understand what I'm saying? You're going from left to right, basically.
Left to right, okay.
Are you still rising and falling in that orbit?
It depends on, the orbit has 2 things. The orbit has a size, and it actually has 6 things that describe it. But it has, first off, if the orbit is for the orbit's in a plane, the plane doesn't have to be in the plane of the equator. The plane can intersect the Earth at any angle at all you want. Just take a sheet of paper and pass it through the Earth at any direction. If you have a sphere, you can pass it through. You can cut an apple through the core. You can cut it across the middle, or you can cut the orbit plane. Orbit is basically in a plane, and that plane can cross the Earth at any angle you want. It can be through the poles, or it can be along through the equator, or it can be, and then that angle is totally independent. The first order, at least, is totally independent of the shape of that, the size and shape of that orbit. The plane the orbit's in can be any plane, and a lot of orbits, for example, are near the pole. They pass almost over the poles. Other orbits, like all the communication satellites, are basically in the plane of the equator, and they can be just about anywhere you want to put them.
And there you're talking geosynchronous, correct?
Geosynchronous orbit, yeah, geosynchronous orbits. They're about 6.5 Earth radii out, and they're very close to circular, very nearly circular orbits, as close as they can make them. And those are circular orbits that are just out there, and they're geosynchronous. It's called, actually, the right word's geostationary. Geosynchronous, all geosynchronous says that it rotates at the same rate as the Earth does. Geostationary says it rotates at the same rate as the Earth does and stays stationary above a point on the equator.
I want to go back to something that you said earlier. You made the comment, when I was saying apoapsis and periapsis, you said that for Earth, it's apogee and perigee, the G meaning Earth.
Yeah.
So does the term change depending on the body? For example,
Yeah, sure.
What is, for example, the moon?
It can be apolune or perilune or aposelene or periselene, depending on what you're looking at. For Mars, it's apoarian and periarian, perigove and apogove for Jupiter, perihelion and apohelion for the Sun. But apoapsis is that's the generic term.
Is there any difference in an apoapsis on the Earth and an apoapsis on the moon?
Well, it's still a high point on the orbit, but except the moon is the center of the orbit for the moon for the moon's apoapsis, or going around Jupiter. Jupiter's the central body. All that the thing at the tail end says is, who am I orbiting around? Am I orbiting around the moon? Am I orbiting around the Earth? Am I orbiting around the Sun? Earth itself has a perihelion and aphelion, and Earth is at perihelion in December, closest to the Sun, not by much, but it also happens to be tilted away from the Sun for us, for the northern hemisphere, so we get winter at that time.
Last area that I want to go to, I want to talk to you about rendezvous, orbital rendezvous.
Sure.
Very difficult to get 2 objects going in an orbit to meet each other and connect.
Yeah.
Can you explain what's happening there?
Well, what happens when you're doing rendezvous, the first thing you want to do is you want to basically, if you're most rendezvous usually have one active body and one passive body. Like the space station will not be maneuvering, and the thing that's rendezvousing will be the active body. It will have the thrusters on it that can change its orbit and this sort of thing. And what you normally do in a rendezvous, and NASA has tried to standardize this, like if you go out to an airport, they standardize the instrument approaches. NASA has tried, and they try to standardize these rendezvous so that they're the same every time. What you do is you approach it from below and behind, and you basically the paths themselves, due to the fact you're both in an orbit, are if you looked at it from a space station point of view, the path would look like a curve, and they're all both falling around the Earth. But basically, you approach it from below and behind, and very, very, very carefully. You come in and you'll hit, and you for example, if you're 10 miles below it, you're probably approaching at about 120 miles an hour. If you're 5 miles below it, you're approaching about 60 miles an hour. If you're 1 mile below it, you're approaching at about 12 miles an hour. So you just work your way up. It's kind of like you do it very, very carefully, but you come in and you don't want to overshoot. But the difference, rendezvous is kind of like driving in traffic on the freeway. As long as you're driving at the same speed as the guy up ahead of you, or you can approach him you're at 60 miles an hour and he's at 58 miles an hour, you're going to approach him very slowly. And, you get closer and you're going to slow back to 59 miles an hour, and then get really close, you're at 58 and you're keeping the same distance. It's the same way they do it with rendezvous. They come up very carefully. When they're far away, they can have a fairly rapid rate of closure, but as you get closer and closer, you basically slow down.
You're talking about relative motion, and the concept that, because we talked earlier about speed and altitude being linked, the concept that you speed up to slow down relative to another object, or vice versa, slow down to speed up, is that a concept that you have difficulty getting across to people because it's so counterintuitive to what we experience on Earth?
Well, what you do, let's say you're below you're below an object, and to get up, to get higher, you have to speed up a little bit. If you're in a circular orbit, a low circular orbit, and he's in a higher circular orbit, you're going slow. You're faster than he is. You're in that low orbit. You're faster than he's moving, but in order to get where he is, you have to speed up a little more, and then you go up that hill, and as you go up that hill, you're coasting up that hill, and you coast up the hill, and Mother Nature, gravity mainly, slows you down. And so if you time it just right, you can speed up and then coast up underneath him, and slowly, and Mother Nature will slow you down enough with gravity to match your speed when you get close to him. And what you basically do is you start far enough behind that you speed up a little bit and get a little higher, and you speed up a little bit and get a little higher, and every time you get a little higher, you slow down again, and sooner or later your speed is, you slowed down more than you sped up. Mother Nature slowed you down more than you sped up, and so as you get a little higher and higher, your speed is getting closer and closer and closer to his.
So if you want to dock two objects, for example, you use the example of the International Space Station and, let's say, Space Shuttle.
Sure.
What you have to do is know your speed relative to your target before you can move towards it.
Oh yeah, you got to know your speed, and you've got to be, and you got to know you've got to know your. First off, you have to be in the same orbit plane. That's number one. If you're out of the orbit plane, you're all out of luck, because plane changing is very, very, very expensive on fuel. You can't afford to do that.
Right.
But if you're in the same plane and you're below him, you have to raise your orbit. You know your speed, you know his, and in today's world we have the GPS, so we know all this information very, very accurately. We used to not know how to do this that accurately. So previously, when early shuttle program and Gemini and Apollo and this sort of thing, when they were doing the rendezvous, they had to do it primarily visually. They did it visually. They would have some optical alignments, and they'd have a standard way of doing things. They would do it exactly the same way every time. That had been figured out mathematically, and they practiced again and again and again in the simulators to do it exactly the same thing, kind of like landing an airplane. you kind of want to do it the same way every time so that you don't drive the landing gear up through the wings or something like that.
You made the comment that you talked about the fuel budget. If you were flying a spacecraft and you wanted to maneuver in orbit, any tips on how to do that most efficiently where you use the least amount of fuel?
Well, it depends on what maneuver you want to do. You want to start a re-entry, or you want to do the one thing you can do if you can arrange it, and sometimes you can and sometimes you can't. You want to do the maneuvers with a certain amount of fuel. You want to do them, if you can arrange it, as low as possible, as long at the low point in the orbit, down at perigee or the periapse, because it's more efficient down there. Let's suppose, for example, I'll give you a real easy example. The energy that you add is the square of the velocity. Okay, is 1/2 mv squared. Mass times velocity squared, but energy is proportional to the square of the velocity. Let's suppose that you're sitting still and you've got enough fuel to speed you up 5 miles an hour. You go from 0 to 5 miles an hour and you've done a certain amount of energy change. Now let's suppose that you're going 100 miles an hour and you go to 105 miles an hour. The difference in energy is much, much greater. It's 105 squared minus 100 squared versus 5 squared minus 0 squared. So the amount of energy you get, it depends on how the speed that you were going to start with.
And once again, that's Dr. Wallace Fowler. He is a professor of aerospace engineering and engineering mechanics with the University of Texas at Austin. Incredibly nice guy. And I'll be honest with you, I have a feeling I'm going to have to listen to that interview about 6 more times, because every time I hear it, I understand something else that he said.
Yeah, you're like, okay. And then, while you're working on that part, he's still talking about a whole bunch of other stuff. They're like, okay, that's flying over my head. I'll try to catch this one.
He's an incredibly nice guy. He just, literally talked to me out of the blue. I asked him if he wouldn't mind if I contacted him again in the future, and he said absolutely wouldn't mind at all. So he'll be back on the program in the future. If you have questions or topics that you would like for him to address, please let us know.
Okay, I'm definitely going to call him next time I'm spiraling out of control. And I'm like, I'm not sure how to stop this orbit. What do I do? And he'll just rattle off some stuff. And I'm like, I'll just crash. I understand crashing.
No, he'll say, press the T key. He'll say, did you F5? Did you? Huh?
Speaking of, I learned what the T key did today.
Yes, you did.
That's where that reference comes from.
Have you learned that the F5 key is your friend?
No. What?
F5 is quick save.
Oh.
Every time, before you do any major maneuver, F5, and then remember F9 quick loads. You will wear those 2 keys out now that you know that.
See, that just goes to show you can learn something every day, especially if you're not learning anything. Like if
even from an old geezer like me.
You don't pay attention to anything, and you learn something new every day.
By the way, I never told you this. Do you know that, I guess because I gifted Kerbal to you on Steam.
Yeah.
Every time you play the game, I get a notification.
So, like, would it tell you if I re-gifted it or something?
Can you? No, seriously, I'll be on like some, like Star Wars WookieePorn.com, and all of a sudden, I'll get this, and I've got Steam set to condescending mode.
Okay.
So it pops up and it says, your friend is playing Kerbal Space Program, and what are you doing with your life? I'm looking at Wookiee porn.
It's funny how something that's having like,
which by the way, I do not recommend.
Yeah, a client that's having you play video games is asking you, what are you doing with your life? Why aren't you playing more video games? And you honestly, you look at it and you're like, I don't know what I was doing.
I have no idea. Well, now let's go ahead and get to the news. Our first news story is actually an update on a news story that we did last week.
So in episode 1, we talked about the mods moving from Spaceport to Curse.com. And we posed the question on whether or not they would all move automatically or if they would be moved by the individual modders themselves. We got a response from Squad saying community members will transfer their work over to the new site, and users would have to upload their stuff individually. And the main reason was for copyright purposes.
There you go. Another story. There's an early access game on Steam known as Orbitalis. And apparently the game's creators are fans of Kerbal Space Program. According to independent developer Alan Zucconi, Orbitalis features homages to other games, including a secret level that recreates the Kerbal solar system. And our next story.
Earlier this year, Kerbal Space Program collaborated with NASA to add the Asteroid Redirect Mission update into the game. It's a simulation of something that the space agency plans to do for real. NASA wants to identify asteroids, redirect them into lunar orbit, and conduct research. Astronauts are currently training in the 40-foot deep swimming pool at the Neutral Buoyancy Laboratory in Houston, Texas. Just as the game update added new features such as gigantic rock parts and a grappling hook, NASA has also added a few new features of their own. The
Rock parts?
Well, yeah, you can start your own band. You can have, like, drums.
I'm sorry. Go ahead. Rocket parts.
NASA...
Sorry.
NASA has also added a few new features of their own. The astronauts are training to use a battery-powered pneumatic hammer. The asteroid redirect mission, the real one, is scheduled to take place sometime in 2020.
You know, speaking of rock bands, I think that would be the cool name of a rock band, Battery-Powered Pneumatic Hammer. Featuring their hit single, Everything Looks Like a Nail. Okay, now we have a new segment, a new feature on our podcast, and this comes from me sitting around wondering what life must be like as a Kerbal. And now, another edition of As the Kerbin Turns.
Honey, I'm home!
Hello, dear. How was your day?
Oh, same as always. The rocket exploded on the launch pad and I burst into flames. Say, isn't that meatloaf I smell?
Tune in next time for another edition of As the Kerbin Turns. Oh, bravo. Bravo. Yeah.
Another
I got
great episode.
Yeah, a tear. I brought a tear to my eye, you know. Honestly, listening to that, it makes me realize life as a Kerbal must really suck.
Well, it really taps into the Kerbal condition.
Yeah.
It makes you realize the struggle a day-to-day Kerbal goes through on Planet Kerbin.
Did you ever play Counter-Strike, the video game?
A little bit, not much.
I've been trying to find it all week, but somebody made a video, in-game Counter-Strike. Was it Machinima?
Yeah.
And it's one of the characters in Counter-Strike suddenly becomes aware that he's a character in Counter-Strike. And he starts trying to convince the other characters that it's just a video game and they're all going to get killed and it's going to start all over again. And he's telling them things like, hey, none of us are wearing the same uniforms. Don't you think that's odd? You're going to go through that hatch. You're going to get killed and we're going to have to do the whole thing again. And the rest of them are like, no, kill, 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 kill. And it ends with him all by himself, listening to them all getting killed. And that's what I was thinking there. I was thinking, Kerbals, it's like, when I log off my game, I'm sure my Kerbals all get together and just smack talk me.
Now, see, the concept you're talking about, a video game character waking up and realizing they're in the video game, I have a very strong theory that is the plot to the new Tom Cruise movie, Edge of Tomorrow. I just watching it, I'm getting there.
Well, let's, before we dig ourselves any deeper, let's move on to our next topic, which is But I Digress. This is where we talk non-Kerbal stuff. And what is our topic today?
Today's topic is space movies. We're going to do movies in our next segment on our next podcast. But for this one, we're talking about realism and realistic space movies.
And how are we doing this? Are we both chosen 3 movies? Is that right?
For this one, we're just going to do one.
Oh, we're going to do one.
Yeah,
okay.
Because it's going to come down to the same couple whenever we say top realistic space movies. The one where Billy Bob Thornton builds one in his backyard.
There you go. The astronaut farmer.
I think if he would have still played the guy from Sling Blade,
I think
it would have been,
Yeah, I'm taking off into space. Mm-hmm. I got me some mustard and biscuits. Mm-hmm.
You can survive a long time on mustard and biscuits. Anyway, for the movie
I'm picking, you with it. Mm-hmm.
For the movie I'm picking, it's a little cheating, but I'm going to go with Apollo 13,
which is what I would have gone with.
Yeah, I mean, that's why I called Firsties. Firsties.
I get lasties.
It's the day before Fridays.
There you go.
Okay, since we both have Apollo 13 as our movie pick, let's each just pick a scene that we really liked. Okay, so my scene is whenever he sits down all the scientists at a table and says, we need to arrange these, turn on all these electronics in a certain order in order to use as little electricity as possible. And so he sits them all down. It's like, and you can't use anything else.
This is not what they have up there.
Yeah.
Don't give me anything they don't have up
Yeah,
there.
because they can't use it. I just thought it was it really shows how stuck they were.
Yeah.
Like you can't, get any new materials. You were stuck with what you had, and you had to, improvise.
One of my favorite scenes in that movie, and I have several, so I've had to kind of narrow this down. One of my favorite scenes in the movie is right after they announce, Houston, we've had a problem. Absolute pandemonium breaks out in Mission Control. Do you remember the scene?
Yeah.
Everybody is going nuts. Everybody's all talking. The music is going. The camera's going all over the place. And then, right in the middle of it, Tom Hanks, Jim Lovell, looks out the window and he sees gas coming out of the side of their spacecraft. And he interrupts and he says, Houston, be advised, we're venting something into space. The movie goes dead quiet. After this huge pandemonium, everything comes to a complete stop. And then finally, the guy who's doing the Capcom says, Roger, Apollo 13, we copy your venting. And then the scene picks up, but it picks up at a much slower pace. But just from a movie-making point of view, that scene to me is so well done. It was this bad situation, but it's that cold slap of reality. This bad situation just got worse. And it's illustrated by the fact that everything just goes quiet. Because you know how people talk about sometimes when the worst things happen, it's like time slows down?
Yeah, yeah.
That's a movie-making technique that I think really emphasizes that point. Now, I'm going to cheat and have another favorite scene.
You go ahead. I'll allow it.
Okay. And the reason I'm going to do this is because I have a gripe about my next favorite scene.
Well, that just balances it out.
There you go.
Positive, negative.
I'm the chosen one. I have balanced the force. I'm not joining the Sith, though. There is that's a Star Wars. Anyway, there's a scene in the movie where Marilyn Lovell and the kids go to visit Grandma, who's in a nursing home, to tell her that the mission has been, it's been compromised. They may not get home, and they're all very upset and they're all very worried. And the grandma says, arguably the best line in the whole movie. She says, if they could get a washing machine to fly, my Jimmy could land it. Love that scene.
Yeah, it's a great line.
Love that scene. But what I don't like, and this is my nitpick, that is a clever, sharp person. Later in the movie, they put her in a room with Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin, and she doesn't know who they are. It's in there for a laugh.
Yeah.
I understand. But to me, after setting her up as such a great character, so sharp and so wise and so clever, to then turn around and act like she wouldn't know who Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin are? And this was a few months out from the moon landing.
Yeah.
Who wouldn't know who they are?
I mean, it was on TV everywhere.
Yeah.
Everyone was watching it. You're going to know who these people are.
Yeah. I mean, unless she was like fading in and out of cleverness.
Yeah, and at that point, it's like they were using the character for comedy,
Yeah.
but they weren't realizing there wasn't continuity in the kind of comedy she was doing.
Yeah. Comedy with a capital K.
Yeah.
Anyway, so those are two of my favorite scenes. One of them has a nitpick, one of them does not. Well, that wraps it up for But I Digress. And as always, that wraps it up for our program as well. I do want to remind you that we would love to hear from you. If you have questions, comments, suggestions, send it to our email address.
Kerbalcast@gmail.com.
You can do text, or if you would like to send us audio, send it as an MP3, and we'd certainly love to use it on the program. In the meantime, enjoy playing Kerbal Space Program. Big thank you to everybody who's written in. Big thank you to Squad. And also a big thank you to the person providing our music for us.
Professor Soap, you can find him at facebook.com/Professor Soap.
And we will see you again next time for another edition of Kerbalcast. I am your LMP, Biff Aldrin, and my CMP,
Nostromo.
See you next time.
Nostromo. And this is what we have ready for you today.
Just go right into it, okay? And also, we would like to thank everybody who took their time to write and comment on the podcast. We have gotten a lot of responses, and the responses have been wonderful. Take two.
Was it the writing in?
I guess. You know what? I was just kind of fumbling.
Today we have an interview with Dr. Wallace Flower.
You rocking the mic. Okay. Boy, we got lots of outtakes now, don't we? Yeah. Okay. I'm not. You know what? I'm not used to being over here. I think.
You want to switch?
No.
Okay. Are you sure?
Yes.